On July 22nd, 2019, she posted a photo on Instagram, happy, tanned by a pool in Corfu. At the same time, he already knew that she was flying away without him. And, as the investigation would later establish, it was then that he began to think through what he would do next. She wrote about her love for travel, about beautiful places and funny stories. Ekaterina Karaglanova, 85,000 followers, comments with hearts, comparisons to Audrey Hepburn. She had just finished her residency in dermatology, and her birthday was ahead. On July 30th, she was to turn 25. The tickets to the Netherlands were already prepared, and so, while she rejoiced in the upcoming trip and posted photos from Greece, Maxim Gariv, a 33-year-old IT specialist, and her ex-boyfriend was coming to her apartment. He saw that suitcase in the corner. He realized it wasn't for him, that this trip was already with someone else. 4 days after that post, she would be discovered in her own apartment, in that very suitcase she had prepared for Amsterdam, with multiple injuries to the neck area. And those 4 days that passed between the happy photo by the pool and what was found in her apartment, that is the story of two parallel worlds that existed simultaneously but never truly touched. In one world, a girl was planning a birthday in Europe with a new man, believed the hardest part was behind her, wrote about impressions, and made plans. In the other world, the man she had left scrolled through her posts, looked at her smile, at that suitcase, at the tickets that did not have his name on them, and thought about something entirely different. These two worlds ran parallel for exactly 4 days, and then one of them destroyed the other. She didn't know that the photo from Corfu would be her last, that people would read the caption about beautiful places and funny stories only after she was gone, and that the comments under that post would gradually change from compliments to condolences. Later, during interrogation, he would say that she humiliated him, called him a broke loser, and doubted his competence as a man. For the investigation, this was generally enough. Jealousy, conflict, emotional breakdown. But how can you look at a person who is packing for a happy trip and at the same time think about how to use that suitcase in a completely different way? So, to understand how she ended up in this relationship at all and what was actually happening there, we need to go back a few months to the moment when she first saw his photo on Tinder. Ekaterina Syomotchkina was born in Ivanteyevka, a small town in the Moscow region, about 40 minutes from Moscow by suburban train. The family was medical. Both her mother and father worked in this field, so the choice of profession might have seemed obvious from the outside. But in fact, she came to it herself. Back in the 8th grade, she debated between medicine and journalism because she was good at languages and humanities and won academic competitions. For about a year, she hesitated, weighed her options, and ultimately chose medicine. She enrolled in Pirogov Russian National Research Medical University, one of the strongest medical universities in the country. From then on, everything went according to the plan she had built for herself. 6 years of study, state exams, accreditation, diploma, then a residency in dermatology. By the age of 24, she was already a practicing physician with a specific specialization. She wasn't planning to become one someday. She had actually become one. In parallel with this, her blog developed. It all started with travel. She loved short trips of 3 to 5 days to a new place, vivid impressions without any dragging on. Venice, Paris, Punta Cana, Ibiza, Santorini. Photos from beautiful places, notes about cities, honest reviews of what she saw. She also chose the surname for the blog herself. Syomochkina became Karaglanova because it sounds brighter and is easier to remember. This was a completely conscious move. She understood how social networks worked and built a personal brand from the very beginning. At some point, she rented an apartment in Moscow and moved away from her parents. The Ramenki district, in the west of the city. She lived alone, paid the rent herself, structured her own schedule between working at the clinic and running the blog, and decided for herself where to go and whom to meet. Her friends would later describe her as a person who knew exactly what she wanted. She didn't waste herself on casual flings and believed in real relationships, not in a hang-out and split-up format, but with some kind of perspective. She wanted a family, but was in no hurry, believing that she first needed to get on her feet and then look for a person. And so, by the beginning of 2019, she had almost everything she had planned for that age. A profession, her own home, a growing blog, financial independence. Only one thing was missing. She decided it was time and downloaded Tinder. His Tinder profile looked like a jackpot. A photo in a formal suit, and not a cheap one. That was immediately obvious. A well-groomed face with neat eyebrows, styled hair, a confident gaze into the camera. Nothing loud, no vulgar poses with a bare chest that usually clutter men's profiles on dating apps. Just a man who clearly takes care of himself and clearly has money. She swiped right, and a match popped up almost immediately. He wrote first, and it wasn't a cliché, "Hi, how are you?" but a normal message with questions about her and interest in her blog. He noticed that she traveled a lot, asked about her favorite places, and the correspondence flowed easily and naturally. After a while, they agreed to meet. He scheduled the first date at a restaurant, not at a fast food joint or a coffee shop on the corner, but at a proper place. He arrived in a good car, dressed exactly as in the photos in his profile. Suit, watch, everything in its place. He ordered for both of them without asking about the prices on the menu. He spoke calmly, listened attentively, and joked moderately. He didn't brag about his achievements, didn't push, and didn't rush things. After dinner, he offered to drive her home. He dropped her off and didn't try to invite himself up to the apartment. An hour later, he sent a message saying it was a pleasure to meet her. For Ekaterina, all of this was a sharp contrast to what she had seen on Tinder before that moment. Guys who, after 3 messages, were already inviting her over to watch a TV series. Guys who disappeared without a trace after the first date. Guys who lied about their work and actually lived with their mother in a one-room apartment. But here, before her, was a grown man with his own apartment, a normal job and manners, who didn't try to drag her into bed on the very first meeting and was clearly interested in continuing to communicate. She told her friends about him. They asked her to send a photo. They looked and said she was lucky. And indeed, he didn't disappear after the first date, as often happens. He wrote the next day and suggested meeting again, then again, and again. Each meeting followed the same scenario: restaurant, flowers, attention. He remembered what she had said on previous dates, asked about her studies, her blog, her plans for the future. He didn't interrupt, didn't steer the conversation toward himself, and it seemed he was truly interested in everything she told him. She began to think she had finally found the one she was looking for. The relationship developed according to the scenario she could only dream of. He appeared with flowers for no reason. Not once a month, on March 8th, but just like that, on an ordinary Tuesday. The bouquets weren't from a stall by the metro, but proper, beautifully arranged ones. He chose the restaurants himself, booked in advance and never asked, "Isn't it too expensive for you?" He took the bill silently, as a matter of course, without even looking at the receipt. Besides flowers, there were gifts, jewelry, clothes, little things she had mentioned in passing. Once she said she liked a certain bag, just in passing, and a week later, the bag was at her home. He went to work in a suit, always ironed, color coordinated. Colleagues would later tell the investigation a detail. He carried 2 sets of clothes with him. One simpler set to get from Kotelniki to the center, and a second formal work set. He changed at the office. This image required effort, and he put it in every day. She posted their joint photos on the blog, not his face, as he asked not to be showcased, but hands, silhouettes, details. Followers asked, "Who is this?" She answered evasively, with a smile. Friends who saw more were openly envious, and he said the right things. Not about, "Let's hang out and see," but about the future, without dates or loud promises, but with the tone of a person who thinks further ahead than a week. She interpreted this as seriousness of intent. By the spring of 2019, she was sure this was the man. Handsome, generous, attentive, mature. She didn't ask questions that could ruin the picture. Where did the money for such a lifestyle come from on an IT specialist salary? Why, at 33, were there no long-term relationships? Why did he know exactly what to say and when? Questions didn't arise, because everything looked perfect. She didn't know then that his charm had a specific price, and that hundreds of other women had already paid that price before her. On dating sites, he was well known, not as a casual user who logs in once a month to scroll through profiles, but as a constant, active, and recognizable character. Those who crossed paths with him on various platforms gave him a nickname, Ken Doll, like Barbie's friend. His appearance matched. Lined eyes, tattooed eyebrows, neat styling. Everything was perfect. Not a single detail out of place. He went on dates constantly, and it wasn't a matter of dozens of meetings, but hundreds. Different women, different platforms, but one rehearsed scenario: restaurant, flowers, attention, a demonstration of generosity, then the next one, and another. Despite all this, he had no long-term relationships to his name. Not a single woman who stayed by his side longer than a few months. He would get acquainted, court them, make an impression, and then either disappear himself or the woman would leave first, sensing something elusive. His reputation was double-edged. On the one hand, generous, handsome, knows how to present himself. On the other hand, something was wrong, although few could explain it in specific words. Women who interacted with him for more than one evening described a strange sensation. Not aggression, not rudeness, rather emptiness. As if behind the facade of the perfect gentleman, there was nothing. One of those who met with him several times would later tell journalists the details. He paid well and left generous tips. But he didn't try to get physically close. He asked her to sit nearby and listen. He talked about his childhood, about his parents, about life. He said he was tired of living. Once he said he had hired a hitman for himself. Because he couldn't end the journey himself, it was a sin. She didn't believe him. She decided he was making it up, that he wanted attention. She continued to see him. So, Ekaterina knew none of this. She didn't cross paths with women who could tell her about the Ken doll. She saw only what he showed. A successful man who, out of all those hundreds, chose specifically her. It seemed like a victory. Her Instagram during that period looked like an advertisement for the perfect life, the kind people dream of while scrolling through others' feeds. Travels to beautiful places, Corfu, Venice, Paris, thoughtful angles, carefully chosen locations, captions about the love of life, photos from restaurants, from beaches at sunset, from good hotels. And between all this, shots with him, a man's hand on her waist, 2 glasses of wine on a table, a bouquet that, as she wrote, he gave her for no reason. Followers asked in the comments, "Who is this man?" She answered evasively, but with a smile, "My person." Under such posts, hearts, compliments, and comments in the spirit of "What a beautiful couple," or "I'm green with envy," appeared. And she wasn't just posting photos. She was consciously building a narrative. A story about a girl who achieved everything herself, a medical degree, the start of a career, a growing blog, and had now found true love. It was a story one wanted to believe in, and one she herself sincerely believed in. The publicity of the relationship was part of her strategy. The logic was simple. If the relationship is real and serious, why not show it? If he's the one, let everyone know. She invested not only emotions into this relationship, but also her reputation. Every post with a hint of him, every photo with a man's hand in the frame was a statement. Everything is fine with me. I found what I was looking for. And so, she put her happiness on display and recorded every moment that confirmed everything was going according to plan. He also saw these posts. He scrolled through her feed, looked at the photos where she was smiling next to him, and read the comments. What he thought in those moments, no one knew. He didn't comment, didn't leave likes, and didn't manifest himself in her public space in any way. He just watched. Meanwhile, behind the scenes of these happy photos, something else was beginning to happen. At first, she didn't attach much importance to it, because everything could be explained by ordinary reasons. He might not answer messages for half a day, and then he would write as if nothing had happened. Was busy at work. Let's talk in the evening. She accepted this explanation without further questions. Work, business, a grown person with his own schedule. He wasn't obligated to report to her every hour about where he was. Then the cancelled plans began. They would agree on dinner. She would get ready and dress up, and he would call an hour before the meeting. It won't work out today. Let's do it tomorrow. No detailed explanations, no special apologies, just a statement of fact. Tomorrow, period. She would agree, move her plans, and convince herself that nothing terrible was happening. And so she began to notice swings in his behavior, which she initially attributed to fatigue. One evening, he was warm and attentive, saying the right words, listening to her, joking, and everything looked like the first weeks of their acquaintance. But on another evening, he became detached and cold, as if he were thinking about something of his own and was somewhere far away. His gaze would drift away in the middle of a conversation. He answered in monosyllables and didn't engage in topics. She asked directly, "Is everything okay? Did something happen?" He would nod. "Yeah, just tired at work." She attributed everything to work and stress, to the fact that all men are like that to some extent. and don't know how to talk about their feelings. She convinced herself that this was normal for any relationship. The honeymoon period can't last forever. There are slumps, periods when people drift apart and then draw close again. But something was gnawing at her from the inside, a feeling she couldn't formulate into words. In several months of their relationship, he had never once introduced her to his friends. Not a single joint outing with his social circle. She had no idea where he spent his time when they weren't together, whom he talked to, what he did, what his life looked like outside of their meetings in restaurants and her apartment. His past also remained closed to her. He talked about work, about some general things, about the news. But not once in all that time did he mention a single ex-girlfriend. Not a single story from past relationships, even in passing, even in the context of a memory. It was as if no one existed before her, which for a 33-year-old man looked strange to say the least. She didn't dig and didn't try to find out details. She didn't check his phone when he stepped away. She didn't stage interrogations or demand reports. She believed that if something was wrong, he would say so himself. Because in normal relationships, people talk to each other. And so, at some point, she decided it was time to start that conversation herself. To talk about the future, about where it was all heading, and what he actually wanted from this relationship. She chose a moment that seemed appropriate for such a conversation. An evening after a good dinner at a restaurant. He was in a normal mood, not detached, not cold, not immersed in his own thoughts. She led the conversation to the desired topic smoothly, without abrupt transitions. First, about her plans for the near future, about work, about how she saw the following year. And then she pivoted to the two of them. She asked directly, without hints or roundabout maneuvers, "What are we building? Where is this going? What are your plans regarding us?" He didn't flare up or demonstratively walk away from the conversation. He answered, but in such a way that it could barely be called an answer. He said that he felt good with her, that he valued what was between them, that he didn't want to rush things and didn't understand why deadlines and frameworks needed to be set, that everything was developing normally anyway, so why complicate things? She continued to push, but gently, without ultimatums. She didn't ask for a ring or a specific wedding date. She just wanted to understand one thing. Was this serious or not? Was there a prospect for them? Or was she wasting time on a person who was not initially set on something long-term? He listened and said a phrase that she would remember many times later. "Let's not do this now. Everything is fine. Don't spoil the evening." And so, she backed down after those words. She decided that it simply wasn't the right time, that she had chosen the wrong moment or pushed too hard. She convinced herself that men are slower to make such decisions. They need more time to mature. She would wait a little longer. She would show him that she wasn't pushing or rushing him, that she knew how to wait and wouldn't make scenes. After that conversation, nothing changed outwardly between them. He still came to her, gave flowers for no reason, and took her to restaurants. Everything looked as usual, as if no conversation had ever taken place. But she would later remember that it was precisely after that evening that something shifted imperceptibly in their relationship. Not immediately or abruptly, but gradually. As if an invisible distance had appeared between them that hadn't been there before. She thought then that he was probably offended by that conversation, or scared that she had begun to demand commitments from him, or simply processing what he had heard and needed time. She decided to give him space and not pester him with questions so as not to aggravate the situation. She didn't know one important thing then. For him, that conversation was not at all about a relationship in the conventional sense, not about feelings or a shared future. For him, it became a signal of an entirely different kind. What exactly did he hear in that conversation over dinner? Clearly, not what she was trying to convey. Not, "I love you and want to be with you." Not, "Let's build something real." He heard something else. A demand, pressure, an attempt to establish control over him. For a person who had built his whole life around certain rules, this conversation became a violation of the order he had created for himself. He met women, gave flowers and gifts, took them to restaurants, and made an impression. But he never promised anything and owed nothing. The format was simple. As long as everyone feels good and no one asks unnecessary questions, we continue. As soon as conversations about "where is this going" begin, it's time to end it. It had been that way before her. It had been that way with dozens, hundreds of other women. One date, then another, maybe a third, and that was it. No explanations, no goodbyes, no attempts to maintain contact. He simply disappeared and moved on to the next. A perfected scheme that suited him. But with Ekaterina, it turned out differently, and it broke the script. She didn't disappear on her own after he began to drift away. She asked direct questions and wanted clear answers. She posted their photos on her blog and built a public story where he was part of her life before an audience of tens of thousands of people. This was exactly what he had always avoided. And there was something else he found out around this time. She had started seeing another man, not instead of him, but in parallel. Or perhaps after she felt his detachment and realized he wasn't going to move forward. This man was 52 years old. He was a follower of her blog, and they met through the comments. He had serious intentions. He had already bought tickets to the Netherlands for her birthday. She made a decision. If this one doesn't make up his mind, there is another option. Gruesome found out about this. In what way? From her words, from correspondence, from other sources, is not fully disclosed in the case files. No, he learned that she was going to fly away without him, that there was someone else ready to give her what she wanted. What he felt, jealousy, anger, wounded pride, a sense of being rejected, remained outside the official protocols. But from that moment, something inside changed, shifted in a direction from which there was no return. In July 2019, a window appeared. She was at home alone. On that day, or thereabouts, she returned to Moscow from Greece, to her rented apartment in the Ramenki district. She returned alone. The suitcase stood in the room. She began packing in advance. The last days of her life have been reconstructed by investigators only in fragments. Not a complete picture, but separate pieces from various sources. She communicated with friends and discussed plans for the near future. She wrote to her mother and kept in touch with her family. She planned what she would wear for her birthday celebration. She discussed the route through the Netherlands and which places she wanted to visit. She was in a good mood, looking forward to the trip and the changes that she felt had already begun to happen. During these days, there was also contact with Gruesome. Their communication hadn't ceased entirely. He came to her, or she to him, or they met somewhere on neutral territory. The exact chronology remains in the case files. The cameras in the entrance of her building recorded his presence. At some point, a conflict occurred between them. When exactly? It was not possible to establish precisely. Maybe the day before it happened. Maybe on the same day. She said something to him that he couldn't accept. Or he said something to her. Or he simply made a decision without words, inside himself, silently. So, on July 26th, he came to her again. And it was on that day that she stopped answering messages. Her phone went silent. Activity on social networks ceased. Her feed froze at the post from Corfu. The last signs that she was in touch were sometime in the morning or afternoon. After that, nothing. Her parents expected a call in the evening, as she called regularly and didn't disappear without warning. They didn't get it. They sent a message, asking if everything was okay. No answer followed. They called. Dial tones, a hang-up, dial tones again. She didn't call back the next day, nor the day after. There was no one left to congratulate her. July 26th, her apartment in the Ramenki district in western Moscow. He came to her that day in a suit, as usual, looking just as he did at all their previous meetings, and nothing in his appearance foreshadowed what would happen next. The door opened. She let him inside. Perhaps she was expecting some conversation and explanation. Perhaps she herself wanted to put an end to the relationship. Or perhaps she didn't think this visit would be any different from dozens of others. What happened next in that apartment is known from the results of the forensic medical examination and the materials of the investigation. There was a quarrel between them. He confirmed this during interrogations. What exactly they talked about remains only in his testimony, and whether to believe it fully or not is an open question because the other party was no longer there. At some point during this quarrel, he took a knife from the kitchen, which was nearby. He didn't bring it with him in advance, if his words are to be believed, but took it there, on the spot, in a fit of what he would later call a state of heat of passion. The autopsy would count multiple injuries to the chest and neck. She didn't have time to defend herself or run away. Everything happened too quickly. No signs of a struggle were found at the entrance to the apartment, which spoke to the suddenness of what occurred. She was dressed not in loungewear, but in what she intended to wear to go out or meet someone. Lace garters on her legs, which would later end up in the inspection reports and the headlines of the Yellow Press, became a subject of discussion and speculation. Whether she was getting ready to go out, or to meet specifically him, or simply dressed that way at home. This detail would remain without a clear explanation. He didn't stop after the first injury, as a person who was truly acting in a state of passion might have. And he didn't stop after the second. He continued methodically, without panic, and without attempts to stop what he had started. Later, during interrogation, he would say a characteristic phrase. "I don't remember how it happened. It was as if I wasn't the one doing it." A classic formulation for those trying to portray a state of passion and shed part of the responsibility. But it was him, and he knew exactly what he was doing at that moment. When it was all over, she lay on the floor of her apartment, with signs of serious injuries, without movement, without breath. The door was closed from the inside. The windows were also closed. None of the neighbors heard anything that evening. No one saw anything suspicious. an ordinary apartment on an ordinary floor of an ordinary building in Ramenki, of which there are thousands in Moscow. She was there alone. And now she was gone. When she stopped breathing and it was all over, he didn't leave the apartment immediately, as might be expected of a person in such a situation. Instead, he looked around and began to assess the situation he found himself in. A discovery lay on the floor. There were traces of serious damage on his clothes. A knife remained in the kitchen. Something had to be done about all this. And that's when his gaze fell on the suitcase standing in the room. The very one in which he had been packing things for the trip to Amsterdam with another man. Large, spacious, on wheels, convenient for travel. He went over, opened it, and pulled out her clothes, which she had neatly folded for the upcoming trip. And then he put inside what remained. She didn't fit entirely. The dimensions wouldn't allow it. He didn't do anything extra to fix this. He just shoved it in as best he could, however it worked out. After that, he tended to himself and his appearance. He took off the clothes with the traces of serious damage, the very suit in which he had come to her. He took a spare set from his bag, the simpler one. He changed right there, in her apartment. The dirty clothes with traces were neatly folded into another smaller suitcase. The knife went in there as well. On the CCTV cameras in the entryway, it would later be seen how he leaves the house with a small suitcase in his hand. On his hands were black gloves, which weren't there when he entered. He walks calmly, without any haste or nervousness, like an ordinary person returning home after visiting acquaintances. Nothing suspicious in his behavior, nothing that could attract attention. He drove the suitcase with the blood-stained clothes away and disposed of it somewhere outside the city. The investigation would later establish these details. Just the main suitcase, the large one containing the discovery, remained in the apartment. He didn't manage to take it out that evening. Or he physically couldn't do it unnoticed. Or he decided he would come back later and finish what he had started. The next day, he was at home in Kotelniki, following the news, expecting to see something about the incident in Ramenki. An incident in an apartment, a young blogger, police on the scene. There was nothing of the sort. Not on the internet, not on television. Complete silence, as if nothing had happened. This surprised him because he expected her to be found almost immediately. That some neighbor had heard noise. That relatives had raised the alarm and come to check. But none of this happened. The apartment remained closed. A day after what happened, he returned to her apartment again. Why exactly? He couldn't coherently explain even to himself during interrogations. The cameras in the entryway recorded this moment. He enters the building again and heads toward her apartment. But by that point, his time was already running out. July 27th passed in silence, then the 28th, then the 29th, 3 days in a row, which for her loved ones turned into growing anxiety, a feeling that something was going wrong. She didn't answer calls or messages, and this was completely unlike her. Her mother wrote every day, as she usually did. At first, ordinary messages, just asking how things were and what was new. Then, when no answer followed, she began to write with a question. Why are you silent? Is everything okay? And then the messages became openly alarmed, with pleas to at least answer briefly. She called her number over and over, but the dial tones went into a void. No one picked up. She would hang up and call again an hour later, hoping her daughter would finally answer. Her friends also began to notice that something was wrong. She hadn't appeared online for several days. She wasn't posting stories, although she usually did so every day. She didn't reply in group chats. For a person who ran an active blog and communicated constantly, such silence was strange. Someone tried to find an explanation that didn't involve anything bad. Maybe she left earlier and didn't have time to say. Maybe her phone broke. Maybe she's busy packing. People were looking for rational explanations because they didn't want to think about anything else. But then came July 30th, and the excuses ran out. It was her birthday. On this day, she was supposed to fly to Amsterdam to celebrate with the new man with whom she had plans for the future. And at the same time, there wasn't a word from her. No call to her family. No post from the airport as she usually did. Total silence, which could no longer be explained by being busy. Her mother called the apartment landlord. She explained the situation and asked him to check if everything was okay. The landlord agreed to come. He had spare keys to the apartment. So, he opened the door, and the first thing that met him was the smell. Heavy, sweetish, unmistakable. That very smell that is impossible to confuse with anything else and which immediately says that something terrible has happened. The smell hit him from the threshold before he could even take a step inside. In the hallway, literally a few meters from the front door, stood a suitcase. Bare legs were sticking out of it. He called the police. That was the first thing he did. Then he dialed the number of the mother who had asked him to check the apartment. He said briefly, "Come over, you need to come." When she reached the house in Ramenki, the apartment was already cordoned off. Investigators, forensic experts, people in uniforms discussing something in low voices. The suitcase stood in the same spot. They hadn't opened it yet, waiting for the experts. They didn't let her go inside. They didn't let her see what was in there. But she understood without words, by the faces of the people who came out and tried not to look her in the eyes, by the heavy silence all around, by the way they looked at her when she said it was her daughter's apartment. And so, what remained of her daughter lay in that suitcase for several days. In the July heat, when it was over 30 degrees outside, in a closed apartment with sealed windows, for several days, while she called and wrote, while she hoped and waited for an answer. The autopsy would later establish the details. The end came from massive blood loss as a result of multiple injuries to the chest and neck. Large vessels were damaged, which led to a rapid and irreversible outcome. There was no chance from the very first injuries. So, investigators noticed important details during the examination. There were no signs of forced entry on the front door. The lock was not damaged, and the hinges were in place. Everything pointed to one thing. She had opened the door herself. She let in someone she knew and trusted. Her things for the trip remained in the apartment. Clothes were partly scattered, partly taken out of the suitcase, which was now being used for something else. Tickets to Amsterdam lay on the table. 2 tickets for a flight to a new life. Her phone was found nearby, completely dead, which had received dozens of messages from people who were looking for her. CCTV footage was preserved. They showed a man entering and, after some time, leaving. His face was visible clearly enough for identification. The investigation got its first serious lead that same day. identifying the person on the recordings was only a matter of time. The image quality allowed for it. In parallel, investigators began interviewing her inner circle: her mother, friends, acquaintances, colleagues. The questions were standard. Who had she seen in the last few days? Who had she met? Who could she let into the apartment without fear? And the answer was practically the same from everyone. Maxim, her boyfriend, or ex-boyfriend, depending on how you count, because everything in their relationship had been complicated lately. Her friends knew his name and could describe his appearance. They had seen photos that Ekaterina had shown, although his face did not appear on her blog at his own request. They knew the relationship had been difficult in the final period. That tension had appeared. They knew she was planning to leave with another man, and that a serious rift had occurred between her and Garayev. So, the investigation tracked him down in less than a day. Cameras, witness testimony, descriptions of his appearance, everything converged on one person: Maxim Garayev. He worked in the information technology sector. He lived in Kotelniki, in an apartment with a mortgage, which indicated there was no particular wealth, despite the image he created. There was practically nothing serious about him in the criminal databases. No convictions for serious offenses. There was some story with an ex-girlfriend, something minor that ended in a fine. Nothing that could have indicated beforehand what he was capable of. They began searching for him through all channels. They checked his place of residence first, but he wasn't there. The apartment was empty. He hadn't shown up at work for several days. His colleagues didn't know where he was. His phone was turned off and could not be located on the network. At the same time, he hadn't fled the city, as often happens in such cases. He didn't go to another region, didn't buy a train ticket. He didn't try to cross the border. He simply disappeared from the radar for a few days, as if he had dissolved and was waiting for something. And so on July 31st, 5 days after she stopped answering, he was found in Kotelniki, near his primary place of residence. In a rented apartment he had taken to wait things out and avoid appearing at home. He was alone and made no attempts to hide. He offered no resistance during his arrest. He opened the door, saw the people in uniform, looked at them, and it was clear from his face that he understood everything immediately. He understood that time was up. They took him quietly, without any drama or special effects. In the apartment where he was hiding, they found little of interest. Clean clothes, ordinary items, nothing that indicated preparations for an escape. No forged documents, no tickets, no hidden money. He wasn't going anywhere. Later, during interrogation, he would explain what was going on in his head during those days. He was waiting. He didn't know exactly when they would find her, but he understood that it would happen. He watched the news every day, scrolled through social media feeds, and when the first headlines appeared about the discovery in the suitcase, he realized there was very little time left. The first interrogation was conducted the same day, a few hours after his arrest. He admitted involvement almost immediately, without persuasion or attempts to bargain. Yes, he was in the apartment. Yes, it was him on the recordings. Yes, it was he who did what was done. The investigators didn't expect such a quick confession. But what he said next, when he began to describe the details, raised questions. He spoke strangely, detachedly, as if he were watching from the side. As if he weren't the one holding the knife, but someone else. He said during the interrogation, "I don't remember the details." He said, "Something came over me. I didn't control myself." He said, "She drove me to it herself with her words." So, the investigators listened and recorded every word. The protocols were filled in even lines, statement after statement. Details, contradictions, questions about whether his version matched reality. All this could be sorted out later. He was sent to a pre-trial detention center immediately after the first interrogations. Custody was formalized at the request of the investigation. The defense didn't even try to seriously contest this measure, as there were no grounds. The Ken doll, as he was called on dating sites, ended up in a cell of a Moscow jail, without an expensive suit, without neat styling, without restaurants and endless dates. The case moved to the investigative stage, and the process of gathering evidence began. But the main question that interested everyone following the story, the why, still had no clear answer. During interrogations, he spoke a lot, willingly answering questions and giving detailed testimony. No, the paradox was, the more he spoke, the less it became clear what had actually happened and what had driven him. His version of events was simple, even too simple to explain everything that had occurred. According to him, she insulted him during the last conversation. She called him a pauper who was incapable of providing for a woman. She humiliated his masculine dignity and mocked his attempts to look successful. She told him directly that she was leaving with another man who was richer, more serious, and better. A classic picture of a crime of passion, a spontaneous reaction to an insult. He didn't plan it, didn't want it, just snapped. This version was generally sufficient for the investigation. There was a confession, a motive, and evidence. The charge was Part 1 of Article 145, from 6 to 15 years. But something in this picture didn't add up. He changed his clothes after everything was over. He calmly took off the clothes with traces of serious damage and neatly folded them into a suitcase. He carried them out of the apartment. He put on gloves that were not there when he entered. He returned a day later to check the situation. This was not passion. A crime of passion is an action followed by flight in a panic, horror at what was done, shaking hands, an inability to think. Here, there was something else. Methodicalness in every action. Cold calculation. A calm head after multiple knife wounds, calm enough to change clothes, pack things, and walk out as if nothing had happened. And another detail that stood out to everyone during the interrogations, he expressed no regret. In all those hours, not a single word of remorse, no tears, no tremor in his voice. He spoke about what happened as if he were talking about a stranger, about a crime news story that had no emotional relation to him. The investigators wrote it all down. Psychiatrists conducted an evaluation. He was fully sane, aware of the nature of his actions, and able to control them. His emotional reactions were adequate to the situation. No pathological abnormalities were found. Only emptiness. That same emptiness behind the beautiful facade that women had noticed before her. Behind the ideal image of a successful man, there was nothing real. After he was arrested and the case received wide publicity in the press, other women began to speak out. Women whose existence no one had previously suspected. Those who knew him long before, Ekaterina. Those he had dated in previous years, whom he had also taken to restaurants, given flowers to, and called his only one. And their stories were surprisingly similar to each other, as if written from a template with small variations. It all started perfectly, practically according to the same scenario. Attention from the first minutes of meeting, gifts, demonstrations of care. He said the right things at the right moments, looked impeccable, and created the feeling that it was serious and that they had a future. The women believed him because there was no reason not to. Everything looked the way real relationships should. Then a shift occurred. Not sharp or sudden, but gradual, almost imperceptible at first. He would start pulling away without any reason or explanation. And then he would simply disappear from her life. No explanations, no parting conversations. He just stopped communicating. His phone number would end up on a blacklist. Messages went unanswered. It was as if he had never existed. Some tried to get explanations, to understand what had gone wrong. One of them got an answer, and later regretted it. He became cold and harsh in conversation, saying things she didn't expect from the ideal gentleman with flowers and restaurants. So, one of these women later told journalists her impressions. "There was something wrong with him," she said, "but I can't explain exactly what. He did everything right. All those dinners, gifts, beautiful words. But inside, it was empty, as if he was playing a memorized role. As if he had learned somewhere how a man should behave on a date and was simply reproducing it." Another said more briefly, "I was lucky that he lost interest in me and switched to another. I didn't realize then how lucky I was. Now, after everything, I understand very well." And so, the question remains, why her? Why, out of all the hundreds of women he met over the years, was Ekaterina the one with whom it all ended like this? Perhaps because she didn't back down when he started pulling away. She didn't disappear herself, as others had before her. She demanded answers and clarity in the relationship. She was leaving for another man, but not quietly. She did so with an open declaration of her intentions. She broke the rules he had lived by for all those years, and he couldn't accept that. The trial took place in early 2020, several months after the investigation was completed. The case was heard by the Nikolinsky District Court of Moscow, the jurisdiction where the incident occurred. Gareev was present at all sessions and looked the same as he did during the interrogations. Calm, even-keeled, without visible emotion, as if what was happening didn't concern him, as if he were observing the process from the sidelines. The prosecution brought charges under Part 1 of Article 105. The prosecutor laid out all the circumstances of the case, the evidence, witness testimony, and the results of the evaluations. He demanded 12 years of imprisonment in a maximum security colony. The defense built its line on the version of a crime of passion. The lawyer argued that the victim herself had provoked the defendant with insults, that he hadn't planned it in advance, hadn't prepared, and hadn't brought a weapon, that he snapped in a single moment and didn't control his actions, that he deeply repented, although it was difficult to read this remorse on the defendant's face. Ekaterina's parents sat in the courtroom at every session. Her mother, the same one who had called the landlord and asked him to check the apartment, who had called her daughter every day without an answer, who had arrived and seen the police cordon, who never entered the apartment, but who didn't need to enter to understand. So the parents filed a civil lawsuit for moral damages for 2.5 million rubles. The court partially satisfied the claim, awarding a smaller amount. This is standard practice for such cases. And then, the verdict was announced. 9 years of imprisonment in a maximum security colony. Not the 12 the prosecutor demanded. Not the 15, which was the maximum under the article. Ekaterina's mother told journalists after the announcement, "It's not enough. It is unfairly little. He will serve 6 or 7 years, taking parole into account and get out. He will be about 40, with a whole life ahead of him. But my daughter has nothing. No life, no future, no family. And I will have no daughter, no grandchildren, nor the future I imagined." Gruesome listened to the verdict standing. His expression did not change. He didn't say a word. When granted his final statement, he was led away by guards. The case was closed. The guilty party was identified. The punishment was assigned, and justice was formally served. Jealousy. This word appears in the case files as the motive. This word conveniently explains for the protocol, for the court, and for statistics why a man took a woman's life. But this word actually explains nothing. Jealousy is an emotion. It is the pain of losing a person who is dear. It is the fear that someone you love is leaving. And so, to be jealous, you must first love. So, he didn't love. Never. 200+ women in a few years. These weren't relationships. It was a conveyor belt. One after another. Meeting, courtship, a few dates, then the next. His nickname spoke for itself. Ken Doll. Perfect on the outside. Handsome, well-groomed, but not alive inside. He didn't feel. He reproduced behavioral patterns. He knew how a man should look on a date, what words to say, and what gifts to give. But it was a role, a memorized program. And so, women gave him what he was looking for. Not love, because love implies reciprocity. Not intimacy, because intimacy requires openness. They gave him attention and admiration, a sense of control, power. As long as a woman looked at him with loving eyes, he existed. As soon as she began to demand more, she became a problem. Ekaterina became a problem he couldn't solve in the usual way. And for a person who built his life on control, it was a blow. Not because he loved and lost, but because he lost control. She stepped out from under his power and went her own way. He did what he did not out of jealousy. She stopped being the source of what he needed. She became a threat, a problem that needed to be eliminated. During interrogations, no remorse. In court, no emotion. In his eyes, nothing. Because there was never anything there. She posted happy photos because she believed in love. He thought about something else because he didn't know what love was. 2 worlds. One, alive, with hopes, plans, and faith in the future. The other, empty, with roles instead of feelings, with control instead of intimacy. They existed side by side, in one relationship, in the same photographs, and then one destroyed the other.